The year was 1847, and the Silverton Ranch stretched across 40,000 acres of prime Texas grassland like a green kingdom beneath the endless sky. Longhorn cattle dotted the rolling hills as far as the eye could see, their distinctive horns catching the morning sunlight as they grazed peacefully along the winding Colorado River. This was the heart of cattle country, where fortunes were made and lost on the strength of a man's word and the quality of his beef. At the center of this empire stood the Silverton Mansion, a testament to wealth and ambition that rose from the prairie like a monument to success. Built from imported limestone and adorned with hand-carved columns that wouldn't have looked out of place in a southern plantation, the house commanded respect from every cowhand, neighbor, and visitor who laid eyes upon it. Its wraparound porches offered sweeping views of the ranch lands, while its tall windows gleamed like watchful eyes over the domain that had made the Silverton name synonymous with power in this part of Texas.
Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you.
Margaret Silverton stood on the front porch of her magnificent home, her steel-gray hair pulled back in a severe bun that matched the hardness in her pale blue eyes. At 52, she had transformed herself from the daughter of a poor dirt farmer into the most powerful woman in 3 counties, and she wore that transformation like armor against a world that had tried to keep her down. Her black mourning dress, worn religiously for the 3 years since her husband's death, served as both a reminder of loss and a symbol of her determination never to appear weak again. The ranch had been built on blood, sweat, and ruthless ambition. Margaret's late husband, Thomas Silverton, had started with nothing but a small herd of scraggly cattle and a dream of something greater. Together, they had fought off Indian raids, survived devastating droughts, and outmaneuvered scheming competitors who would have gladly seen them fail. When Thomas died in a riding accident, leaving Margaret to run the empire they had built together, the vultures had circled immediately, expecting a grieving widow to crumble under the pressure of managing such a vast operation. They had been spectacularly wrong. Margaret Silverton had proven herself more ruthless and capable than her husband had ever been, expanding their holdings, negotiating better prices for their beef, and earning a reputation as someone who would destroy anyone foolish enough to cross her. She ruled her empire with an iron fist wrapped in a velvet glove, charming when it served her purposes and merciless when kindness showed weakness. But there was one problem that all her wealth, power, and determination could not solve. One source of shame that threatened to undermine everything she had worked to achieve. That problem had a name, Victoria Silverton, her only child and the greatest disappointment of her life. Victoria Torai Silverton sat in the breakfast room of the mansion, picking nervously at her eggs while her mother's disapproving gaze burned into her like a brand. At 24, Tori possessed the kind of generous curves that polite society whispered about behind fans, and that her mother viewed as a personal affront to the family name. Her auburn hair caught the morning light streaming through the tall windows, and her green eyes held an intelligence and warmth that might have been considered beautiful if not for the extra weight that made her the subject of cruel gossip throughout the county. The silence between mother and daughter stretched like a taut rope ready to snap. Margaret's breakfast sat untouched before her, cooling in the Texas heat while she studied her daughter with the same calculating expression she used when evaluating livestock. This was not a loving mother concerned for her child's well-being. This was a businesswoman assessing a problematic asset that threatened to damage her carefully cultivated reputation. Mrs. Henderson was here yesterday, Margaret said finally, her voice carrying the crisp authority that had cowed countless cowboys and competitors. She mentioned that her son Robert has been asking about eligible young ladies in the area. He's recently returned from his business ventures in New Orleans, and she believes he might be ready to settle down and start a family. Torai's fork clattered against her plate as she set it down with shaking hands. She knew exactly where this Conversation was heading, and the familiar dread began to settle in her stomach like a lead weight. Robert Henderson was the third son of their nearest neighbors, a man known throughout the county for his gambling debts, his drinking problem, and his cruel treatment of anyone he perceived as beneath his station. The thought of being married off to such a man made her feel physically ill. "Mother, please," Tori began, her voice barely above a whisper. "You know I have no interest in Robert Henderson. He's cruel and dissolute, and everyone knows he only wants to marry for money. Surely there must be someone else, someone who might actually care for me rather than just see me as a means to pay his debts." Margaret's laugh was as cold as a winter wind across the prairie. "Care for you? My dear child, you seem to have developed some very romantic notions about marriage that have no basis in reality. Marriage is a business arrangement, a joining of families and fortunes that benefits both parties. The idea that someone might care for you in the way you seem to imagine is a luxury that women in your position cannot afford." The words hit Tori like physical blows, each one carefully calculated to destroy what little confidence she had managed to maintain. Margaret had perfected the art of emotional cruelty over the years, wielding shame and disappointment like weapons against her daughter's spirit. In Margaret's mind, this wasn't cruelty but necessity, the harsh lessons required to force her daughter into accepting the realities of her situation. "Your position," Margaret continued, rising from her chair to pace the length of the breakfast room like a general planning a campaign, "is that of a woman who has failed to secure a suitable husband despite numerous opportunities. You are 24 years old, Victoria, well past the age when most women of good family have established themselves in advantageous marriages. Your appearance and your weight have made you unmarketable to the kind of men who would normally court the daughter of a family like ours." Tori felt tears beginning to sting her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She had learned long ago that showing emotion only encouraged her mother's attacks, providing evidence of the weakness that Margaret despised above all else. Instead, she sat perfectly still, her hands folded in her lap, trying to maintain some shred of dignity while her mother systematically destroyed her self-worth. "I have spent considerable time and money attempting to find you a suitable husband," Margaret went on, her voice growing colder with each word. "I have hosted parties, arranged introductions, even considered lowering our standards to include men from less prominent families. But time and again, you have failed to secure even the most modest proposal. Do you understand what this means for our family's reputation?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a gunshot. Tori understood all too well what her mother meant. In a society where a woman's worth was measured by her ability to attract and marry well, Tori's continued spinsterhood reflected poorly on the entire Silverton name. Every social gathering where she appeared without a suitor, every season that passed without an engagement announcement, served as a public reminder of what Margaret viewed as her greatest failure as a mother. "I understand, Mother," Tori said, quietly, her voice steady despite the turmoil in her heart. "But surely forcing me into a marriage with a man like Robert Henderson cannot be the answer. He would make me miserable, and everyone knows he would squander whatever dowry you provide within a year of our wedding. How does that serve the family's interests?" Margaret stopped pacing and turned to face her daughter, her eyes blazing with a fury that had been building for years. "How does it serve our interests? It removes you from this house and this community, where your continued presence serves as a daily reminder of my failure to raise a daughter worthy of the Silverton name. It provides you with a husband, regardless of his qualities, which is more than you have managed to accomplish on your own. And it finally puts an end to the whispers and speculation about why the richest family in the county cannot manage to marry off their only child." The brutal honesty of her mother's words left Tori speechless. She had always known that Margaret was disappointed in her, but to hear it stated so plainly, with such cold calculation, was more devastating than any physical blow could have been.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us now. Back to the story.
In that moment, she realized that her mother didn't see her as a daughter to be loved and protected, but as a problem to be solved, an embarrassment to be hidden away. The confrontation that would change everything came 3 days later when Robert Henderson arrived at the Silverton Ranch to formally court Tori. He rode up to the mansion on a flashy stallion that was clearly beyond his means, dressed in expensive clothes that showed more style than substance. His dark hair was slicked back with pomade, and his smile held the kind of calculated charm that set Tori's teeth on edge from the moment she saw him. Margaret had arranged everything with military precision. The parlor had been decorated with fresh flowers, the finest china had been brought out for afternoon tea, and Tori had been dressed in her most flattering gown, though even her mother's careful styling could not disguise the figure that Margaret considered so problematic. The stage was set for what Margaret hoped would be a successful courtship, leading to a quick engagement and an even quicker wedding. Robert's approach to courtship was as subtle as a stampeding bull. He complimented Tori's dress while his eyes lingered inappropriately on her figure, spoke at length about his business ventures without asking about her interests, and made several pointed references to the Silverton family's wealth and the opportunities that marriage might provide for an ambitious young man. His intentions were so transparent that even Tori, who had little experience with suitors, could see through his performance. "Miss Silverton," Robert said, leaning closer than propriety allowed, "I must say that your mother has not exaggerated your charms. A woman of your obvious qualities must have had many suitors competing for your attention. I consider myself fortunate to have the opportunity to present myself as a candidate for your affections." The falseness in his voice made Tori's skin crawl. She could smell the whiskey on his breath despite the early hour, and she noticed how his hands shook slightly when he reached for his teacup, clear signs of the drinking problem that was common knowledge throughout the county. This was the man her mother wanted her to marry, the solution to the problem of her continued spinsterhood. "Mr. Henderson," Tori replied carefully, trying to maintain the polite facade that her mother expected. "You are very kind to say so. I hope you will not think me too forward if I ask about your plans for the future." A woman naturally wishes to know something about the character and intentions of a gentleman who pays her such attention. Robert's smile faltered slightly at the unexpected question. He had clearly expected a more passive reception, a grateful acceptance of his interest rather than any kind of interrogation about his suitability as a husband. His recovery was smooth, but not quite quick enough to hide his irritation at being questioned by a woman he obviously considered beneath his standards. "My plans are quite ambitious, I assure you," he said, his voice taking on a harder edge. "I have several business ventures in development that will require a certain amount of capital investment. A man of vision must sometimes take calculated risks to achieve the success that allows him to provide properly for a wife and family. I'm sure a woman of your intelligence can appreciate the wisdom in such an approach." Tori understood perfectly. Robert Henderson was looking for an investor as much as a wife, someone whose family's wealth could fund his gambling and business ventures, while providing him with the social status that came with marrying into one of the county's most prominent families. The realization filled her with a cold fury that surprised her with its intensity. "I see," she said, her voice growing noticeably cooler. "And what guarantees might a woman have that such investments would be handled responsibly? I have heard that business ventures can be quite risky, and a wife might naturally be concerned about her family's financial security." The question hit its mark like a perfectly aimed arrow. Robert's face flushed red with anger and embarrassment, and for a moment, his carefully constructed mask of charm slipped completely. Margaret, who had been watching the exchange with growing alarm, quickly intervened before the situation could deteriorate further. "Victoria, dear," she said with forced sweetness, Perhaps you and Mr. Henderson would enjoy a walk in the garden? The roses are particularly beautiful this time of year, and I'm sure you both could use some fresh air after our delightful conversation. But the damage had already been done. Robert Henderson was not a man accustomed to being questioned or challenged, especially not by a woman he considered his social inferior. He stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the polished wooden floor with a harsh screech that echoed. "Through the suddenly silent room, Mrs. Silverton," he said, his voice tight with barely controlled rage. "I thank you for your hospitality, but I find that I have pressing business elsewhere. Please give my regards to your daughter when she learns to conduct herself more appropriately in the presence of a gentleman." With that, he stormed out of the parlor, leaving mother and daughter alone in a silence that crackled with unspoken recriminations. Torai could hear his boots echoing on the marble floor of the foyer, followed by the slam of the front door and the thunder of hoofbeats as he rode away. She had successfully driven off yet another suitor, but the victory felt hollow when she saw the expression on her mother's face. Margaret Silverton stood frozen for a long moment, her face a mask of fury and humiliation that made her look like an avenging angel preparing to rain down divine wrath. When she finally spoke, her voice was so quiet and controlled that it was more terrifying than any shouting could have been. "You foolish, ungrateful child," she whispered, each word falling like a stone into still water. "Do you have any idea what you have just done? Do you understand the consequences of your selfishness and pride?" The confrontation that followed was unlike anything that had ever occurred between mother and daughter before. Margaret's carefully maintained composure cracked completely, revealing the seething resentment and disappointment that had been building for years. All the polite fiction of maternal concern disappeared, replaced by a cold fury that seemed to fill the elegant parlor like smoke from a prairie fire. 24 years old, Margaret said, beginning to pace again with sharp, agitated steps. 24 years old, and you have just driven away what may have been your last chance at a respectable marriage. Do you think suitors grow on trees, Victoria? Do you imagine that there are dozens of men waiting in line for the privilege of marrying a woman who has already proven herself unmarketable? Torai tried to defend herself, to explain that Robert Henderson was clearly unsuitable, and that she could not possibly be happy married to such a man. But her mother cut her off with a gesture so sharp and dismissive that it might as well have been a slap across the face. "Happy?" Margaret laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. "You speak of happiness as if it were something you have a right to expect. Marriage is not about happiness, Victoria. It is about security, respectability, and the continuation of family lines. Happiness is a luxury that women in your position cannot afford." The words stung because Torai could hear the grain of truth buried within their cruelty. She was indeed unmarried at an age when most women had already established themselves in the community through advantageous matches. Her weight and unconventional appearance had indeed limited her options in a society that valued beauty and conformity above intelligence or character. But accepting these facts did not make her mother's solution any more palatable. "I would rather remain unmarried than bind myself to a man who sees me only as a source of income," Torai said, finding a core of steel within herself that she had never known existed. "Robert Henderson is a drunkard and a gambler who would squander whatever dowry you provided within months of our wedding. How is that preferable to spinsterhood?" Margaret stopped pacing and turned to face her daughter with an expression of such cold rage that Torai instinctively stepped backward. "Because," Margaret said, her voice dropping to a whisper that somehow carried more threat than any shout, "spinsterhood means that you remain here, in this house, a constant reminder of my failure as a mother and the Silverton family's inability to properly place their only child. Every day that you remain unmarried is another day that our neighbors whisper about what must be wrong with you. Another day that your continued presence undermines the respect and authority that I have spent my entire adult life building." The Brutal honesty of the statement left Torai speechless. Her mother was not concerned about her happiness or well-being. She was concerned about her own reputation and the social consequences of having an unmarried daughter. In Margaret's mind, Torai's refusal to accept Robert Henderson was not an act of self-preservation, but an act of selfish rebellion against the family's interests. "You have embarrassed me for the last time," Margaret continued, her voice growing, stronger as her anger crystallized into cold determination. "I have tried patience. I have tried encouragement. I have tried every reasonable approach to help you understand your responsibilities as a member of this family. But you have rejected every opportunity, spurned every suitor, and shown nothing but ingratitude for the advantages your birth has provided." Torai could see something changing in her mother's expression, a hardening that suggested Margaret was reaching some kind of final decision. The air in the room seemed to grow thicker, charged with the kind of tension that preceded thunderstorms on the Texas prairie. Whatever her mother was about to say, Torai knew it would change everything between them forever. "If you cannot behave as a proper daughter of this family," Margaret said finally, her words falling like an executioner's axe, "then perhaps it is time you learned what it means to have no family at all." The plan that Margaret revealed over the following days was so shocking in its cruelty that Torai could hardly believe her own mother had conceived it. For 3 days after the disastrous encounter with Robert Henderson, Margaret had locked herself in her study, emerging only for meals that were eaten in tense silence. Torai had hoped that her mother was simply allowing her anger to cool. That time would bring some kind of reconciliation, or at least a more reasonable approach to the problem of her unmarried state. She could not have been more wrong. When Margaret finally summoned her to the study on the 4th day, Torai found her mother seated behind the massive oak desk that had once belonged to her father, surrounded by maps, legal documents, and correspondence that suggested extensive planning and preparation. Margaret's expression was calm and controlled, but there was a coldness in her eyes that made Torai's blood run cold. "I have been in communication with Chief Ojishida of the local Odawa tribe," Margaret announced without preamble, her voice carrying the matter-of-fact tone she used when discussing business arrangements. "He has agreed to accept you as compensation for a long-standing debt that your father incurred several years ago regarding water rights and grazing boundaries." The words hit Torai like a physical blow, leaving her gasping and struggling to understand what she had just heard. Her mother was proposing to give her to a Native American tribe, to hand her over like a piece of property to settle a business debt. The casual manner in which Margaret presented this plan made it even more horrifying. "Mother, you cannot be serious," Torai whispered, her voice barely audible above the pounding of her own heart. "You cannot possibly mean to give me to the Indians. What you are suggesting is barbaric, inhuman. I am your daughter, not a piece of livestock to be traded away when I become inconvenient." Margaret's expression did not change. If anything, her resolve seemed to strengthen in the face of her daughter's horror and disbelief. "You forfeited the right to be treated as my daughter when you rejected every opportunity I provided to secure your future through marriage. You have made it clear that you prefer to remain unmarried rather than accept the responsibilities that come with your station in life. Very well. If you will not marry a civilized man, perhaps living among savages will teach you to appreciate what you have spurned." The cruelty of the plan was breathtaking in its scope. Margaret had clearly spent considerable time researching the legal and practical aspects of her proposal, ensuring that it could be carried out without interference from local authorities or neighboring families. The debt she referenced was really a dispute over water rights that had been settled through negotiation rather than legal action, leaving room for reinterpretation and additional compensation. "The chief has assured me that you will be treated according to their customs and traditions," Margaret continued, as if she were discussing the sale of cattle rather than the fate of her only child. "You will have the opportunity to make yourself useful to their community in whatever capacity they deem appropriate. Perhaps the experience of living without the luxuries and advantages you have always taken for granted will teach you to value what you have rejected. Torai felt the world spinning around her as the full implications of her mother's plan became clear. She was to be handed over to people she had never met, forced to live among a culture she knew nothing about, all because she had refused to marry a man who would have made her miserable. The punishment was so disproportionate to the crime that it seemed like something from a nightmare rather than reality. "You cannot do this," she said, her voice growing stronger as desperation gave her courage. "I will not allow it. I will run away. I will seek help from our neighbors. I will expose your plan to anyone who will listen. This is kidnapping, Mother. This is selling your own daughter into slavery." Margaret's smile was as cold as winter moonlight on snow. "You will do none of those things, Victoria, because you have nowhere to go and no one who will help you. Our neighbors all know about your difficulties in finding a suitable husband, and they will view this arrangement as a reasonable solution to an embarrassing problem. As for running away, where exactly do you propose to go? You have no money, no skills, and no connections outside of this community. You would be back here within a week if you survived that long on your own." The terrible truth of her mother's words settled over Torai like a suffocating blanket. She was indeed trapped by circumstances beyond her control, dependent on a family that no longer wanted her, and surrounded by a community that viewed her as a failure. Margaret had calculated every angle, anticipated every possible escape route, and systematically closed them all. "The arrangement has already been made," Margaret concluded, rising from her desk with the satisfied air of someone who had successfully completed a difficult business transaction. "Chief Ojishida will arrive tomorrow morning to collect you. I suggest you use the time remaining to you to pack whatever personal belongings you wish to take, though I'm told that many of your current possessions will be inappropriate for your new circumstances." As Torai fled from the study, tears finally flowing freely down her cheeks, she could hear her mother's final words echoing behind her like a curse. "Perhaps when you have experienced life without the benefits of civilization, you will finally understand the value of what you have rejected." Dawn broke over the Silverton Ranch with the kind of brilliant red sky that old-timers claimed foretold either great fortune or terrible disaster. Torai stood at her bedroom window, still wearing the same dress from the previous day, watching the sun climb slowly above the horizon while her packed belongings sat in a small leather satchel beside her bed. She had not slept, could not sleep, knowing that this morning would mark the end of everything she had ever known. The sounds of the ranch awakening drifted up from below, cowboys calling to each other as they prepared for the day's work. Cattle lowing in the distance, the familiar creak of the windmill that pumped water for the house and outbuildings. These were the sounds of her childhood, the background music of a life she had always taken for granted and would soon lose forever. Each familiar noise felt like a small knife cutting into her heart. A soft knock at her door interrupted her melancholy reverie. "Miss Victoria," came the gentle voice of Rosa, the Mexican woman who had served as both cook and surrogate mother to Torai since childhood. "Your mama says to come down for breakfast. She says the Indian chief will be here soon." Rosa's voice carried a note of barely controlled emotion. Unlike Margaret, who viewed servants as interchangeable tools for maintaining her household, Torai had always treated Rosa with genuine affection and respect. The older woman had watched Torai grow from a chubby, cheerful child into a thoughtful young woman, and the thought of losing her was clearly devastating. "I will be down shortly, Rosa," Torai replied, trying to keep her voice steady. "And Rosa? Thank you for everything you have done for me over the years. I want you to know that your kindness has meant more to me than I can ever express." The silence that followed spoke volumes. Rosa understood, as all the household staff did, that this was not a temporary arrangement or a visit to distant relatives. This was a permanent exile, a casting out that would likely mean they would never see Torai again. The injustice of it hung heavy in the air like smoke from a distant fire. When Torai finally descended to the dining room, she found her mother, already seated at the head of the long mahogany table, calmly eating her breakfast as if this were any ordinary morning. Margaret had dressed with particular care in her finest black silk dress, her hair arranged in an elaborate style that emphasized her authority and social status. She looked like a woman preparing for an important business meeting rather than a mother about to abandon her only child. "Good morning, Victoria," Margaret said, without looking up from her plate. "I trust you slept well and have prepared yourself for your departure. Chief Ojishida is a punctual man, and I would not want to keep him waiting." Torai took her seat at the table, though the thought of food made her stomach churn with nausea. The breakfast that Rosa had prepared, fresh eggs, bacon, biscuits with honey, looked and smelled delicious, but it might as well have been sawdust for all the appetite she could muster. This would be her last meal in her childhood home, her last morning at the table where she had shared countless breakfasts with her parents during happier times. "Mother," she said quietly, making one final attempt to reach whatever maternal feeling might still exist in Margaret's heart. "I have been thinking about our conversation yesterday, and I wonder if perhaps we might find some compromise. If marriage is truly so important to you, I am willing to reconsider Robert Henderson's proposal, despite my reservations about his character." Margaret's laugh was sharp and bitter. "My dear child, that opportunity has passed. Mr. Henderson made his feelings quite clear when he left here 3 days ago. He will not be offering his hand again, and even if he were foolish enough to do so, I would not accept on your behalf. You had your chance to secure a respectable marriage, and you rejected it out of pride and foolish romantic notions." The finality in her mother's voice made it clear that no amount of pleading or negotiation would change the outcome. Margaret had made her decision with the same cold calculation she applied to all her business dealings, and like all her business decisions, it would be carried out exactly as planned regardless of the human cost. "Besides," Margaret continued, delicately cutting her eggs with surgical precision, "this arrangement serves multiple purposes. It removes you from a situation where your continued presence reflects poorly on the family. It settles an outstanding debt with the Odawa tribe, and it provides you with the opportunity to learn some much-needed lessons about gratitude and responsibility. You should view this as an educational experience rather than a punishment." The sound of approaching horses interrupted Margaret's cold lecture, and both women looked toward the front windows of the dining room. Through the lace curtains, Torai could see a small group of riders approaching the house at a measured pace that suggested confidence rather than haste. Her heart began to race as she realized that her fate was literally riding up the front drive. Chief Ojishida rode at the head of the group, and even from a distance, Torai could see that he was not at all what she had expected. The stories she had heard about Indian chiefs from books and newspapers had led her to imagine someone wild and frightening, decorated with war paint and feathers, carrying weapons and radiating menace. Instead, the man approaching her home looked dignified and composed, sitting his horse with the easy grace of someone born to leadership. He was younger than she had anticipated, perhaps in his early 30s, with strong, regular features, and long dark hair that was braided with small ornaments that caught the morning light. His clothing was a mixture of traditional Native American garments and practical frontier wear, buckskin leggings and moccasins, but also a cotton shirt and a leather vest that would not have looked out of place on any cowboy. Most surprising of all was his bearing, calm, alert, and possessed of a natural authority that commanded respect without demanding it. Behind him rode 3 other men, clearly warriors but showing none of the savage hostility that Torai had been taught to expect from Indians. They looked like men going about their business with quiet competence, alert to their surroundings but not seeking trouble. Their horses were well cared for, their equipment was in good repair, and their overall appearance suggested a people who were organized, disciplined, and far more civilized than popular prejudice would suggest. Margaret rose from her chair with the brisk efficiency of a woman accustomed to conducting business meetings. "Victoria, remain here while I speak with Chief Ojishida. I will call for you when the negotiations are complete." But Torai found herself standing as well, driven by a sudden need to face her fate with whatever dignity she could muster. "No, mother. If you are determined to go through with this arrangement, then I will face it directly. I will not cower in the dining room like a child while you discuss my future with strangers." For a moment, Margaret looked surprised by her daughter's unexpected show of backbone. But the surprise quickly gave way to a grudging respect. "Very well, but you will conduct yourself with appropriate dignity, and you will not embarrass the family name with any unseemly displays of emotion." The front porch of the Silverton mansion had witnessed many important moments in the family's history business. Negotiations, political discussions, social gatherings that shaped the community's development. But nothing in its past had prepared it for the surreal scene that unfolded that morning as a mother prepared to hand over her daughter to settle a debt. Chief Ojishida dismounted from his horse with fluid grace and approached the porch with measured steps. Up close, Torai could see that he was even more impressive than he had appeared from a distance. He stood tall and straight, with broad shoulders and the kind of quiet strength that came from a lifetime of physical challenges. His dark eyes were intelligent and observant, taking in details of the house, the grounds, and the two women waiting for him with the careful attention of someone accustomed to reading situations quickly and accurately. "Mrs. Silverton," he said, his English clear and unaccented, "I have come as we discussed. I trust you are prepared to honor the agreement we made." His voice was deeper than Tura had expected, with a resonant quality that seemed to vibrate in her chest. There was no hostility in his tone, but there was also no warmth. He was conducting business, fulfilling an obligation, and his manner suggested that he viewed this transaction with the same professional detachment that Margaret had shown throughout the process. "Chief Ojishida," Margaret replied with a formal nod. "Welcome to Silverton Ranch. Yes, I am prepared to fulfill our agreement. This is my daughter, Victoria. She is healthy, unmarried, and has been raised with all the advantages that civilized society can provide. I trust you will prove useful to your people in whatever capacity you deem appropriate." The casual way her mother spoke about her, as if she were indeed a piece of livestock being evaluated for purchase, made Torai's cheeks burn with humiliation. But she forced herself to stand straight and meet Chief Ojishida's gaze directly when he turned his attention to her. If she was to be judged and found wanting, at least she would face that judgment with dignity. Chief Ojishida studied her. For a long moment, his expression unreadable. His eyes traveled over her face, her figure, her posture, but there was nothing lewd or insulting in his examination. He was simply assessing what he was receiving, much as Margaret might evaluate a horse or a piece of property. When he finally spoke, his words were addressed to her rather than to her mother. "You are Victoria Silverton," he said, making it a statement rather than a question. "Your mother tells me that you have refused several opportunities for marriage, and that you prefer to remain in your father's house rather than establish your own family. Is this true?" The directness of the question caught Torai off guard. She had expected him to conduct his business entirely with Margaret, treating her as property rather than as a person with opinions and feelings. The fact that he was asking for her perspective suggested a complexity to his character that she had not anticipated. "Yes, it is true," she replied, her voice stronger than she had expected it to be. "I refuse to marry men who saw me only as a source of income or social advancement. I believe that marriage should involve mutual respect and affection, not just financial convenience." Chief Ojishida nodded slowly, as if her answer confirmed something he had already suspected. "And now your mother gives you to me to settle a debt. Do you understand what this means for your future?" The question was asked without cruelty, but its implications were devastating. Torai was being forced to confront the reality that her life as she had known it was ending. that she was about to enter a world completely foreign to everything she had ever experienced. But there was something in the chief's manner that suggested he was not asking out of malice, but out of a genuine desire to understand her situation. "I understand that I have no choice in the matter," she said quietly. "My mother has made it clear that I am no longer welcome in this house, and you have agreed to accept me as payment for my father's debts. Beyond that, I understand very little about what awaits me." Chief Ojishida's expression softened slightly at her honest response. For the first time since his arrival, Torai saw something that might have been sympathy flicker across his features. "Your honesty is appreciated," he said. "Many people in difficult circumstances try to deceive themselves or others about their situation. You face reality directly, and that will serve you well in the days ahead." He turned back to Margaret, who had been watching the exchange with barely concealed impatience. "The debt is considered paid," he announced formally. "From this moment, Victoria Silverton is under the protection of the Odawa people. She will be treated according to our customs and traditions, and her well-being will be my responsibility." Margaret nodded briskly, clearly eager to complete the transaction and put this embarrassing chapter of her life behind her. "Excellent. Victoria, collect your belongings and say your goodbyes. Chief Ojishida is a busy man, and I'm sure he does not wish to delay his departure unnecessarily." But when Torai turned to go back into the house for her small satchel, Chief Ojishida's voice stopped her. "Wait," he said, addressing Margaret, with a new edge in his tone. "I wish to understand something. You give away your only child to settle a debt that could be paid in many other ways. You have cattle, land, money. Why choose this solution?" Margaret's composure flickered for just a moment, and Torai saw something that might have been shame cross her mother's features before the familiar mask of cold authority reasserted itself. "My reasons are my own, Chief Ojishida. Our agreement specified the terms of payment, and I am fulfilling those terms exactly as discussed." "Yes," the chief replied, his dark eyes boring into Margaret's with uncomfortable intensity. "But understanding your reasons helps me understand what kind of woman I am accepting into my tribe. A daughter cast off by her own mother for failing to marry presents certain questions about her character and her past." The subtle challenge in his words clearly rattled Margaret, who was accustomed to having her decisions accepted without question. "Victoria has been a disappointment to this family," she said defensively. "She has rejected numerous opportunities for marriage and shown herself to be ungrateful for the advantages her birth has provided. I believe that learning to live without those advantages will teach her valuable lessons about responsibility and gratitude." Chief Ojishida's expression did not change, but something in his stillness suggested that Margaret's explanation had not impressed him. "I see," he said quietly. "And you believe that casting out your child will accomplish this education?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a gunshot. Margaret opened her mouth to respond, then seemed to think better of it. She had clearly not expected to have her motives questioned by the very person she was conducting business with, and the experience was obviously uncomfortable. "Victoria," Chief Ojishida said, turning back to her, "go collect your belongings. We have a long journey ahead of us." Torai's final moments in her childhood home passed in a blur of conflicting emotions. As she gathered her few possessions, a change of clothes, her mother's old Bible, a small silver locket that had belonged to her grandmother, she tried to memorize every detail of the room, where she had spent so many hours dreaming of a different future. Rosa appeared in the doorway, tears streaming down her weathered cheeks. "Miss Victoria," she whispered, "I have packed some food for your journey, and I want you to take this." She pressed a small cloth bundle into Torai's hands. Inside was a beautifully carved wooden cross that had belonged to Rosa's own grandmother, along with a pouch of herbs and medicines that Rosa had gathered from her garden. "For protection," she explained, "and to remember that someone will always love you, no matter how far you travel." The simple kindness of the gesture broke through Torai's carefully maintained composure, and tears began to flow freely down her cheeks. Rosa had shown her more maternal affection in that single moment than Margaret had displayed in months of supposedly caring for her daughter's future. "Thank you, Rosa," Torai whispered, embracing the older woman tightly. "I will never forget your kindness or your love. Take care of yourself and remember me fondly." When Torai emerged from the house carrying her small bundle of possessions, she found Chief Ojishida waiting patiently beside a gentle-looking mare that he had apparently brought specifically for her use. The consideration implied by this preparation surprised her. She had half expected to be forced to walk or to ride double with one of the warriors. "Can you ride?" he asked as she approached. "Yes," she replied. "My father taught me when I was young, though I have not ridden much in recent years." He nodded and gestured toward the mare. "This is Ayana. She is calm and steady, and she will carry you safely. We have far to travel, and much of it will be through country you have never seen." As Torai prepared to mount the horse, she caught sight of her mother standing on the front porch, watching the proceedings with an expression that was difficult to read. For just a moment, she thought she saw something that might have been regret or second thoughts flickering across Margaret's features. But when their eyes met, Margaret's face hardened again into its familiar mask of cold authority. "Goodbye, Victoria," Margaret called out, her voice carrying clearly across the yard. "I hope this experience teaches you to value what you have." Rejected, Torai opened her mouth to respond, to make one final plea for understanding or forgiveness, but Chief Ojishida's hand on her arm stopped her. "Do not give her words power over you," he said quietly, so that only she could hear. "The past is behind you now. Your future lies ahead." The small procession that left Silverton Ranch that morning moved with the steady pace of experienced travelers who had a long journey ahead of them. Chief Ojishida rode at the front, his bearing alert and confident as he guided them across country that Torai had never seen despite living her entire life in the area. Behind him came his 3 warriors, men whose names she had not yet learned, but who seemed to accept her presence without question or hostility. As they crested the first hill beyond the ranch boundaries, Torai turned in her saddle to look back at the only home she had ever known. The mansion stood white and imposing against the green backdrop of the ranch lands, its windows glinting in the morning sun like watching eyes. Somewhere in that house was her mother, probably already going about her daily business as if nothing momentous had occurred, as if she had not just traded away her only child. The sight of the disappearing ranch filled Torai with a mixture of grief and relief that she could barely understand. Grief for the loss of everything familiar and comfortable, relief at escaping the constant pressure and disappointment that had characterized her relationship with her mother. As the house finally disappeared behind the rolling hills, she felt as if she were watching her old life vanish like smoke on the wind. Chief Ojishida seemed to sense her emotional turmoil without turning around to look at her. "The leaving is always difficult," he said, his voice carrying back to her over the sound of the horse's hooves. "But sometimes we must lose what we think we want in order to find what we actually need." His words were spoken without condescension or false comfort, simply as a statement of observed truth. Torai found herself wondering about his own experiences with loss and change, about what circumstances had brought him to the point where he would accept a white woman as payment for a debt. There was clearly more to this man than the savage stereotype she had been raised to expect. The countryside they traveled through was beautiful in a way that Torai had never fully appreciated from the confines of the ranch. Rolling hills covered with prairie grass stretched to the horizon, broken by stands of oak and cottonwood trees that provided welcome shade from the climbing sun. Wildflowers dotted the landscape with splashes of color bluebonnets, Indian paintbrush, and black-eyed Susans that seemed to nod in greeting as they passed. By midday, the heat had become intense enough that Chief Ojishida called a halt beside a small creek that wandered through a grove of pecan trees. The warriors dismounted and began tending to their horses with practiced efficiency, while the chief approached Tori to help her down from her mount. "We will rest here during the heat of the day," he explained as she accepted his assistance. "In dismounting, the horses need water and rest, and you are not accustomed to long hours in the saddle. We will continue when the sun begins to drop toward the horizon." His consideration for her comfort and limitations surprised her once. Again, she had expected to be treated as a burden or a piece of unwanted baggage, but instead he seemed genuinely concerned for her well-being. As she settled gratefully in the shade of a large pecan tree, she found herself studying this man who had accepted responsibility for her future. Chief Ojishida was not what she had expected in any way. His leadership of the group was quiet and understated, based on respect rather than fear. His treatment of her was courteous without being familiar, protective without being possessive. Most intriguingly, his command of English was perfect, suggesting an education and cultural sophistication that contradicted everything she had been taught about Native Americans. "Chief Ojishida," she said hesitantly as he settled nearby. "To eat his midday meal, may I ask you something?" He nodded, his dark eyes meeting hers with patient attention. "Why did you agree to my mother's proposal? Surely there were other ways she could have settled her debt to your people." He was quiet for so long that she began to think he would not answer. When he finally spoke, his words were measured and thoughtful. "Your mother's debt was not about money or property," he said. "It was about respect and understanding between our peoples. She had made promises that she did not keep, agreements that she broke when it became convenient to do so. Taking her daughter was not about gaining property, it was about teaching her that words and commitments have consequences." The explanation made Tori's situation even more complex than she had realized. She was not just being abandoned by her mother, she was being used as a lesson, a living reminder of the importance of keeping one's word. The weight of that responsibility settled on her shoulders like a heavy cloak. "And what about me?" she asked quietly. "What am I to become among your people? What is my purpose, my role?" Chief Ojishida's expression softened slightly as he considered her question. "That," he said, "is something you will discover in time. Among the Odawa, a person's worth is not determined by their birth or their appearance, but by their actions and their character. You will have the opportunity to prove yourself through service to the community, through learning our ways, through showing that you can contribute to the well-being of the tribe." His words offered hope where she had expected only despair. For the first time since this ordeal began, Tori felt a flicker of possibility rather than just resignation. Perhaps this exile from everything she had known might become something more than just punishment. Perhaps it might become a chance to discover who she truly was when freed from her mother's expectations and society's prejudices. 3 days of hard travel through increasingly wild country brought them to a landscape that seemed to exist in a different world entirely from the manicured ranchlands Tori had always known. The Odawa village nestled in a hidden valley where the Brazos River curved through stands of ancient oak and cypress trees, their massive trunks creating cathedral-like spaces filled with dappled sunlight and the sound of flowing water. Bark-covered wigwams dotted the riverbank in carefully planned clusters, while gardens of corn, beans, and squash stretched up the gentle slopes in neat, productive rows. Tori's first glimpse of her new home came as they crested a ridge overlooking the valley, and the sight took her breath away with its unexpected beauty. This was not the primitive encampment she had imagined, with smoky fires and scattered debris, but rather a well-organized community that seemed to exist in perfect harmony with the natural landscape around it. Children played in the shallows of the river while women worked at various tasks near their homes, and men moved purposefully between the fields and workshops that supported the village's daily life. The arrival of Chief Ojishida's party created a stir of interest but not alarm among the villagers. People paused in their activities to watch the newcomers, their expressions curious but welcoming as they recognized their returning chief. But Torai could feel the weight of dozens of stares as word spread quickly through the community that their leader had brought back a white woman, the payment that had been negotiated for the Silverton family's broken promises. Chief Ojishida dismounted near the center of the village and helped Tori down from her mare with the same quiet courtesy he had shown throughout their journey. "Welcome to your new home," he said simply, his words carrying neither triumph nor regret, merely the acknowledgement of a fact that would now shape both their lives. "Come, there are people you must meet." The first person he led her to was an elderly woman whose weathered face spoke of decades of wisdom and experience. Her gray hair was braided with small shells and feathers, and her dark eyes held a penetrating intelligence that seemed to look straight through to Torai's soul. She wore a beautifully decorated buckskin dress that marked her as someone of importance within the tribal hierarchy. "This is Nokomis, my grandmother, and the keeper of our women's traditions," Chief Ojishida explained as the old woman studied Torai with frank curiosity. "She will guide you in learning our ways and help you find your place among our people." Nokomis spoke in rapid Odawa to her grandson, her tone making it clear that she was asking pointed questions about the circumstances that had brought this white woman to their village. Chief Ojishida's responses were patient but brief, and Torai could sense an undercurrent of discussion about her future that she could not understand, but that would clearly determine her fate. Finally, Nokomis turned her attention directly to Tori, switching to heavily accented but clear English. "So you are the daughter who was not wanted by her own mother," she said without preamble, her words hitting like stones thrown into still water. "Your mother trades you away like a horse or a cow, and now you come to live with people you have been taught to fear and despise. What do you have to say for yourself?" The directness of the question, delivered without hostility but with absolute frankness, left Tori momentarily speechless. But she realized that this moment would set the tone for everything that followed, and she needed to respond with honesty rather than the polite evasions that had characterized so much of her life at the ranch. "I say that I am here through no choice of my own, but I am not ungrateful for the protection Chief Ojishida has offered me," she replied, meeting the old woman's penetrating gaze directly. "I have been taught many things about your people that I suspect are not true, and I hope to learn what is actually true through my own experience, rather than through the prejudices of others." Nokomis nodded slowly, a hint of approval flickering across her features. "At least you do not pretend that you chose to come here, or that you welcome this change in your circumstances. Honesty is a good beginning, even when the truth is uncomfortable." The wigwam that became Torai's new home was a marvel of practical engineering that challenged every assumption she had held about primitive living conditions. The curved framework of saplings was covered with sheets of birch bark that had been sewn together with such skill that not a drop of rain could penetrate the seams. Inside, woven mats covered the floor, and carefully arranged storage baskets held everything from clothing to food to the tools needed for daily life. Nokomis showed her how the structure worked with the efficiency of someone who had lived in such dwellings for 70 years. The fire pit in the center provided heat and light while allowing smoke to escape through a carefully designed opening at the top. Sleeping areas were defined by hanging mats that could be adjusted for privacy or open for communal activities. Most remarkably, the entire structure could be disassembled, moved, and reconstructed in a matter of hours when circumstances required the village to relocate. "Your people build houses from stone and wood that cannot be moved," Nokomis observed, as she helped Torai arrange her few possessions in the space that had been designated as hers. "They plant themselves in one place like trees and fight to defend that place even when it no longer serves their needs. We build homes that can travel with us, that adapt to changing seasons and circumstances. Which approach serves life better?" The question was clearly rhetorical, but it forced Torai to examine assumptions she had never thought to question. The massive stone mansion where she had grown up suddenly seemed less like a symbol of permanence and strength, and more like a prison that bound its inhabitants to a single way of life. Her first attempts at adapting to Odawa daily routines were clumsy and often comical. The simple task of preparing corn for cooking, which involved pounding dried kernels in a wooden mortar until they became meal, left her arms aching and her results uneven and gritty. The other women watched her efforts with patient amusement, offering guidance through gestures and broken English when her technique proved particularly ineffective. "Like this," said Ayana, a young woman near Torai's own age whose gentle manner reminded her of Rose's kindness. Ayana demonstrated the proper rhythm and angle for the pestle, showing how efficiency came from technique rather than brute force. "Feel the grain, do not fight it. Work with the corn, not against it." The wisdom embedded in that simple instruction seemed to apply to much more than food preparation. As Torai gradually improved her corn grinding technique, she began to understand that successful adaptation to this new life would require her to work with Odawa customs rather than resisting them, to find ways to contribute rather than simply enduring her circumstances. Water carrying proved to be another humbling experience. The clay vessels used by Odawa women were larger and heavier than anything Tori had ever attempted to manage, and her first trip to the river ended with most of the water sloshing out before she made it halfway back to the village. The watching children found her struggles highly entertaining, though their laughter was more delighted than cruel. But it was the work in the gardens that provided Torai's first real success in her new environment. Her years of helping Rosa tend the kitchen garden at the ranch had given her genuine knowledge about plants and growing conditions, and she discovered that many of the principles she had learned applied equally well to Odawa agricultural techniques. "You know about growing things," observed Mijizi, an older woman who supervised much of the village's farming activities, as she watched Torai identify and carefully remove weeds from around the bean plants. "Your hands understand what plants need." The approval in her voice was the first real recognition Torai had received since arriving at the village, and it filled her with a warmth that surprised her with its intensity. For the first time in her adult life, she was being valued for something she could actually do, rather than criticized for things she could not change about herself. Despite these small victories, Torai could not escape the reality that she was an outsider in a close-knit community, and not everyone welcomed her presence with Nokomis's pragmatic acceptance or Ayama's gentle kindness. Some of the younger men made it clear through glances and whispered comments that they viewed her as a burden imposed on the tribe, another mouth to feed who contributed little of value to their collective welfare. Makak, one of the warriors, who had accompanied Chief Ojishida on trading expeditions to white settlements, was particularly vocal in his skepticism about the wisdom of accepting a white woman into their community. His English was good enough to make his opinions clear without being filtered through translation. "She eats our food but cannot hunt," he complained during a village council meeting that Tori was not supposed to understand, but could hear clearly from her nearby wigwam. "She takes up space in our village but knows none of our skills. She is soft and weak from a life of luxury, and she will never be able to contribute anything useful to our people." His words stung because they contained enough truth to be genuinely painful. Torai was indeed struggling to master the basic skills that Odawa women took for granted, and her soft hands and rounded figure made it obvious that she had never faced the kind of physical challenges that shaped daily life in the village. But what hurt most was the growing realization that some members of the community saw her presence as actively harmful rather than merely useless. The criticism reached a crescendo during her third week in the village when her attempt to help with the smoking of meat for winter storage resulted in a small fire that damaged several days' worth of carefully prepared food. The accident happened when she misunderstood instructions about adjusting the ventilation in the smoking lodge, causing the fire to flare up and char valuable supplies that the community could not easily replace. The silence that followed the Discovery of her mistake was more devastating than any amount of shouting or anger could have been. The women who had been working alongside her stared at the ruined meat with expressions of dismay and frustration, while Torai stood frozen with horror at the magnitude of what she had done. "I am so sorry," she whispered, tears streaming down her face as she looked at the blackened remains of food that represented hours of skilled labor. "I thought I understood what you wanted me to do, but I was wrong. Please, tell me how I can make this right." Nokome studied the damage with the calm assessment of someone who had dealt with countless crises over the decades. "Crying will not restore the meat," she said matter-of-factly. "And apologies will not fill empty bellies when winter comes. What will you do to repair the harm you have caused?" The question forced Torai to move beyond self-pity and focus on practical solutions. She spent the rest of that day, and most of the next, morning working frantically to salvage what could be saved from the damaged meat. Cutting away the charred portions and re-smoking the salvageable pieces, using techniques she learned through careful observation and patient instruction from the other women. But more importantly, the crisis sparked something in her that had been dormant since her arrival at the village. Instead of simply accepting her role as an incompetent outsider, she began actively seeking ways to contribute skills and knowledge that might be valuable to the community. Her literacy, rare among the Odawa, proved useful for keeping records of trade negotiations with white merchants. Her knowledge of European cooking techniques helped improve the preparation of foods obtained through trade. Most significantly, her experience with the medicinal herbs that Rosa had taught her about created opportunities to work alongside the village's traditional healers. Many of the plants that grew in Odawa territory were familiar to her from her grandmother's old journals and Rosa's teachings, and she discovered that she could identify and prepare remedies that complemented the tribe's existing medical knowledge. "You have good medicine hands," observed Wabagwan, the elderly woman who served as the village's primary healer, as she watched Torai carefully prepare a poultice for a child's infected wound. "Your plant knowledge comes from a different tradition, but the spirits that live in healing herbs are the same everywhere." This validation from someone whose skills were crucial to the community's well-being marked a turning point in how Torai was perceived by the other villagers. She was no longer just the white woman who had been dumped on them as payment for a debt, but someone who could contribute genuine value to their collective welfare. The change was gradual but unmistakable. Children who had once stared at her with wary curiosity began approaching her with the natural friendliness of young people who sensed acceptance rather than rejection. Women who had watched her struggles with barely concealed impatience began including her in conversations and seeking her opinions on matters related to her areas of expertise. Even some of the men who had initially questioned her presence began to acknowledge her contributions with grudging respect. When her medicinal knowledge helped save the life of a hunter who had been badly injured in a fall, even Makek admitted that perhaps there was more to the white woman than he had initially believed. Chief Ojishida observed these changes with quiet satisfaction but made no direct comment on her progress. His leadership style involved allowing people to find their own paths rather than forcing specific outcomes, and he seemed content to let Torai's integration into the community proceed at its natural pace. But Torai sensed his approval in small gestures, a nod of acknowledgement when she successfully completed a difficult task, a slight smile when he overheard others praising her efforts. As the weeks passed and her skills improved, Torai began to experience something she had never felt before, the satisfaction of being genuinely useful to a community that valued her contributions. At the ranch, she had been constantly reminded of her failures and shortcomings, her inability to conform to her mother's expectations for a proper daughter. Here, among people who measured worth through actions rather than appearances, she was discovering capabilities she had never known she possessed. The transformation was not just external, but internal as well. The constant anxiety and self-doubt that had characterized her life at the ranch began to fade. replaced by a quiet confidence that grew stronger with each successful day. She was still the same person, with the same physical characteristics. That had made her mother despair, but she was beginning to understand that those characteristics did not define her value as a human being. The first autumn of Torai's life among the Odawa brought revelations that transformed her understanding of both herself and the man who had accepted responsibility for her future. As the leaves turned brilliant shades of gold and crimson along the river, the village prepared for the annual buffalo hunt that would provide meat and hides essential for surviving the coming winter. It was during these preparations that she began to see Chief Ojishida not just as the leader who had claimed her as payment for a debt, but as a complex man whose quiet strength masked depths of character she was only beginning to understand. The hunt required careful planning and coordination among all the village's adult men, and Torai watched with growing fascination as Chief Ojishida orchestrated the complex logistics involved in moving dozens of hunters across hundreds of miles of territory. His leadership was never loud or commanding in the way she had seen among the ranch foremen back home, but rather a subtle influence that guided discussions toward consensus and inspired confidence through competent preparation. He was not born to be chief, Nokomis explained one evening as they worked together preparing pemmican for the hunting party's journey. His older brother Majisi was groomed from childhood to lead our people, trained in all the skills and traditions that make a great chief. But Majisi was killed in a raid 3 summers ago, and leadership fell to Ojishida when he was still learning what it meant to put the tribe's needs before his own desires. This revelation added new layers to Torai's understanding of the man who had shaped her fate. She had assumed that his authority was something he had always possessed, but now she realized that he too was growing into a role that had been thrust upon him by circumstances beyond his control. The parallel between their situations was not lost on her, both of them forced by tragedy to become something different from what they had originally expected their lives to hold. The night before the hunting party's departure, Chief Ojishida sought her out as she sat by the river watching the sunset paint the water in shades of copper and gold. His approach was quiet, as always, but there was something different in his manner that suggested this conversation would be unlike their previous brief exchanges about practical matters. "You have adapted well to our ways," he said, settling beside her on a fallen log that had become her favorite place for evening reflection. "Nokomis tells me that your medicine knowledge has been valuable to our healers, and even Macaque admits that you work hard despite your soft upbringing." The compliment warmed her more than she cared to admit, but she sensed that he had not sought her out simply to praise her progress. "You speak as if you are surprised by my ability to learn and contribute," she replied carefully. "Did you expect me to remain helpless and useless forever?" Chief Ojishida was quiet for a long moment, his dark eyes fixed on the flowing water before them. "When your mother offered you as payment for her debt, I accepted because it served justice," he said finally. "She had broken faith with my people, and taking her most precious possession seemed like appropriate compensation for her dishonor. But I realize now that I thought of you as an object to be claimed, rather than a person with your own worth and potential." His honesty was both painful and liberating. She had suspected that his initial interest in her had been purely transactional, but hearing him acknowledge it directly forced them both to confront the reality of how their relationship had begun. Yet there was something in his tone that suggested his feelings had evolved beyond those original calculations. "And now?" she asked, her voice barely audible above the sound of the water lapping against the riverbank. "How do you think of me now?" The question hung between them like a bridge that could either connect them more deeply or collapse under the weight of unspoken truths. Chief Ojishida turned to look at her directly, and she saw something in his expression that she had never seen before: vulnerability, uncertainty, and what might have been the beginning of genuine affection. "Now I think that perhaps your mother did not understand what she was giving away," he said quietly. She saw only your failures to meet her expectations, but she was blind to your actual strengths. You have courage that shows itself in quiet determination rather than loud declarations. You have intelligence that seeks understanding rather than just advantage. You have kindness that extends even to those who have not earned it. His words struck her with unexpected force, not because they were flattering, but because they seemed to see her as she had always hoped to be seen, as a complete person rather than a collection of disappointing characteristics. For the first time since childhood, someone was describing her in terms of her positive qualities, rather than cataloging her failures and shortcomings. You speak of courage, she said, her voice trembling slightly with emotion, but I feel like a coward most of the time. I was afraid to stand up to my mother when she made her cruel plans, afraid to defend myself when Robert Henderson insulted me, afraid to face the future you offered when you took me from the ranch. Where is the courage you claim to see? Chief. Ojishida smiled, a rare expression that transformed his normally serious features into something warm and approachable. Courage is not the absence of fear, he said. It is doing what must be done despite the fear. You left everything familiar and learned to live among strangers whose ways were foreign to you. You faced criticism and doubt while continuing to work toward acceptance and contribution. You took responsibility for your mistakes and found ways to repair the harm you caused. These are not the actions of a coward. The validation in his words was like water to someone dying of thirst. Torai had spent so many years accepting her mother's harsh judgments and society's dismissive attitudes that she had almost forgotten what it felt like to be valued and appreciated. But more than just the comfort of approval, his words offered her a new way of understanding her own story, not as a series of failures and rejections, but as a journey of adaptation and growth. Why are you telling me this now? She asked, sensing that there was more behind his unexpected openness than simple kindness. What has changed? Chief Ojishida was quiet again, but this time his silence seemed to be about gathering courage rather than considering his words. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight of significance that made her heart race with anticipation and anxiety. Because I want you to understand that you are not here as punishment anymore, he said slowly. You are not a debt being paid or a burden being endured. You are a member of this community who has earned her place through her own efforts and contributions. And you are a woman who has captured the attention and respect of a man who thought he was too focused on leadership responsibilities to notice such things. The implications of his statement hit her like a physical shock. He was not just acknowledging her value as a community member. He was expressing personal interest that went far beyond the transactional relationship that had brought them together. The possibility that this strong, respected man might actually care for her as a woman, rather than simply tolerating her as an obligation, was almost too overwhelming to process. Ojishida, she whispered, using his name for the first time. Since arriving at the village, what are you saying? He reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away if she chose, and took her hand in his much larger one. His palm was calloused from years of hard work and weapon handling, but his touch was gentle and careful, as if he were holding something precious that might break if handled roughly. I am saying that what began as duty has become something deeper, he replied. I am saying that I have watched you transform from a frightened, rejected woman into someone strong and valuable and beautiful, and that watching that transformation has changed me as well. I am saying that I would like to explore what might develop between us if you are willing to consider such a possibility. The hunting party departed the next morning in a flurry of activity that prevented any immediate response to Chief Ojishida's unexpected declaration, but his words continued to echo in Torai's mind throughout the days that followed. The village felt strangely empty without the presence of its adult men, and the women threw themselves into the tasks of autumn preparation with increased intensity to compensate for the absence of their usual companions and protectors. Nokomis observed Torai's distracted state with the sharp eyes of someone who had witnessed decades of human drama and recognized the signs of a woman grappling with matters of the heart. "My grandson spoke to you before he left," she said matter-of-factly. One afternoon as they worked together processing wild rice that had been gathered from nearby marshlands. "His words have given you much to think about." The old woman's directness no longer surprised Turi, but the knowing look in her eyes suggested that Nokomis understood far more about the situation than she was revealing. "Did he discuss his intentions with you?" Torei asked, trying to keep her voice casual despite the turmoil of emotions she was experiencing. "A chief does not need permission from his grandmother to court a woman," Nokomis replied with a slight smile. "But a wise man seeks counsel from those who love him when he contemplates decisions that will affect not just his own happiness, but the welfare of his people. Ojishida has been carrying the burden of leadership alone since his brother's death, and I have watched him grow strong and capable in that role. But I have also watched him grow lonely." The revelation that Chief Ojishida had discussed his feelings with his grandmother added weight to his declaration, suggesting that his interest was serious rather than merely impulsive. But it also raised questions about how the community would react to a romantic relationship between their chief and the white woman who had been accepted as payment for a debt. What do the other members of the tribe think about the possibility of such a relationship? Torai asked, voicing the concern that had been troubling her since their conversation by the river. Would they accept me as the partner of their leader, or would they see it as another burden imposed on them by circumstances beyond their control? Nokomis set down her work and studied Torai with the penetrating gaze that seemed to see straight through to the heart of any matter. "That depends," she said finally, "on whether you see yourself as worthy of such a role, or whether you still think of yourself as the unwanted daughter who was cast off by her own mother." The question struck at the core of Torai's internal struggle. Despite the progress she had made in adapting to Odawa life and earning acceptance from the community, she still carried deep wounds from her mother's rejection and society's dismissal of her worth. The idea that someone as respected and capable as Chief Ojishida might genuinely care for her challenged assumptions about herself that had been reinforced throughout her entire adult life. "I have spent so many years believing that I was unworthy of love and respect," she admitted quietly. "My mother made it clear that I was a disappointment and an embarrassment, and every potential suitor either rejected me outright or saw me only as a source of income. It is difficult to suddenly believe that I might actually be valuable to someone, especially someone whose opinion matters so much to the community." Nokomis nodded with the understanding of someone who had counseled many young women through similar struggles with self-worth and identity. "Your mother was a fool who could not see the treasure she possessed," she said bluntly. "But her blindness does not define your value any more than her cruelty defines your character. You must decide for yourself whether you will continue to live by her judgments or whether you will embrace the truth of who you have become among people who see you clearly." The weeks that followed were filled with subtle courtship rituals that deepened Torai's understanding of Odawa customs while allowing her relationship with Chief Ojishida to develop gradually and naturally. He returned from the successful buffalo hunt bearing gifts specifically chosen for her, a beautifully carved bone needle case for her sewing work, a necklace of polished stones that complemented her coloring, and a small pouch of rare herbs that would enhance her medicine making. But more meaningful than the gifts themselves was the attention he paid to her interests and activities. He sought her opinion on matters related to trade negotiations with white settlements, recognizing that her background gave her insights into the motivations and expectations of people from her former world. He asked about her medicinal work and listened carefully to her explanations of different healing approaches, treating her knowledge with the same respect he showed to the tribe's traditional healers. Their conversations during evening walks along the river became a cherished ritual that both looked forward to throughout each day. Away from the eyes and ears of the community, they could speak freely about their hopes, fears, and dreams for the future. Torai learned about his struggles with leadership responsibilities that had been thrust upon him too young. While he came to understand the depth of loneliness and rejection that had shaped her early life, I sometimes wonder what would have happened if circumstances had been different. He confided one evening as they sat watching the stars emerge in the darkening sky. If your father had not incurred debts to my people, if your mother had not chosen to pay those debts with her daughter, if you had married one of the suitors who courted you at the ranch, would we ever have met? Would you ever have discovered the strength and capability that your former life kept hidden? The questions were both romantic and philosophical, inviting her to consider how the painful circumstances that had brought them together might actually have been necessary for their eventual happiness. I think, she said slowly, that I would have remained forever trapped in a life that never allowed me to become who I was meant to be. I would have married someone who saw me as a convenience or a burden, and I would have spent my life trying to be someone I was not in order to please people who could never truly value me. Chief Ojishida took her hand in the gesture that had become natural between them, their fingers intertwining with the comfortable familiarity of a connection that was growing stronger each day. Then perhaps, he said quietly, we should be grateful for the pain that brought us together, even though neither of us would have chosen such a difficult path. His words crystallized something that had been forming in her heart throughout the autumn months, the recognition that her exile from everything familiar had not been punishment, but liberation, not loss but discovery. In losing the life she had thought she wanted, she had found the life she actually needed, complete with work that fulfilled her, a community that valued her, and a man who loved her not despite her differences, but because of the unique qualities those differences had helped her develop. The realization filled her with a peace and contentment she had never experienced before, a sense of being exactly where she belonged with exactly the right person. As winter approached and the village prepared for the months of close community living that the cold season would require, Torai found herself looking forward to the future with excitement rather than anxiety, confident that whatever challenges lay ahead could be faced successfully with Chief Ojishida by her side. Winter settled over the Odawa village like a heavy blanket, bringing brutal cold that tested both human endurance and community bonds. It was during one of these long winter nights that a lone rider appeared at the village edge, carrying news that would shatter the peaceful world Torai had come to love. The messenger was Kichi, a young warrior who had ridden through blizzard conditions to deliver urgent intelligence. His horse was lathered with sweat despite the freezing temperatures, and his face showed the strain of hard travel through dangerous weather. "Chief Ojishida," he called out, his voice carrying through the still winter air. "I bring word from the eastern settlements. There are cavalry patrols moving toward our territory, led by men who carry papers with your name and the name of the white woman who lives among us." Torai felt her blood turn to ice as the implications became clear. Someone from her old life had not forgotten her existence, and that someone possessed enough influence to mobilize military resources. Kichi's report painted a picture of coordinated action. A cavalry unit of 30 men had been dispatched from Fort Richardson with orders to investigate reports of a white woman being held captive by hostile Indians. The unit was led by Captain William Morrison and accompanied by a civilian who matched the description of Margaret Silverton. The woman who rides with the soldiers claims that her daughter was kidnapped and forced into slavery. Kichi continued, his eyes finding Torai in the crowd. "She carries legal documents that she says prove ownership of the captive, and she has convinced the military commanders that this is a matter of rescuing a white woman from savage captivity." The bitter irony wasn't lost on Torai. Margaret had personally arranged her exile as punishment, but now she was presenting herself as a grieving mother, seeking to rescue her enslaved daughter. "How long do we have?" Chief Ojishida asked, already formulating defensive strategies. "2 days, perhaps 3 if the weather worsens." Kichi replied, "They move slowly because of supply wagons, but they have scouts who know this country. They will find us." The Emergency council brought together all the village's senior warriors and elders to debate options that ranged from bad to worse. Some argued for immediate relocation, abandoning their winter shelters to move the community before the soldiers arrived. Others proposed fighting defense, using terrain knowledge to ambush the cavalry unit. The third option was the one Tori had been dreading. Several elders suggested that returning her to the soldiers might satisfy their objectives and protect the village from military action. She came to us as payment for a debt, argued Makak. If keeping her here brings destruction on our people, then perhaps it is time to return her to her own kind. Chief Ojishida's response was swift and decisive. Victoria is not property to be traded according to convenience. She is a member of this community who has earned her place through service. I will not abandon someone under my protection. But Torai could see the strain in his expression, the weight of leadership responsibilities requiring him to balance personal feelings against the welfare of families who depended on his judgment. There is another possibility, she said quietly. I could go to them voluntarily. If I surrender myself before they reach the village, it might satisfy their objectives without creating confrontation that would endanger everyone here. The silence that followed was heavy with conflicting emotions. Chief Ojishida's pain was evident as he asked, "You would abandon everything you have built here? You would return to a life that offered you nothing but rejection, simply to spare us the inconvenience of defending what is right?" His words crystallized what she was proposing to sacrifice. She had discovered acceptance, purpose, genuine love, and the possibility of a meaningful future. Returning to her mother's control would mean abandoning all of that. Before anyone could respond, the sound of approaching horses shattered the night silence. The cavalry patrol had arrived earlier than expected. Citizens of this illegal encampment, came a voice amplified by the crisp winter air. This is Captain Morrison of the United States Army. We demand that you produce Victoria Silverton immediately and surrender her to lawful custody. Chief Ojishida rose slowly, his bearing dignified despite the crisis. I will speak with them, but Torai stepped forward and placed her hand on his arm. Let me go first. This confrontation is about me, and I should face it directly. The look that passed between them contained everything they had never had. Time to say love, regret, hope, and shared understanding that whatever happened next would change their lives forever. If you go out there, he said, his voice heavy with emotion, you may never come back to us. Your mother has legal authority over you in white law, and these soldiers will not recognize any claim we might make to your allegiance. Then I will have to find a way to come back, she said simply, kissing him briefly. Wait for me, and trust that what we have built together is strong enough to survive whatever challenges we must face. She walked out into the bitter winter night, where armed soldiers waited to escort her back to a life she thought she had escaped forever. The scene outside was both familiar and terrifying. Captain Morrison sat his horse with rigid military posture, flanked by soldiers with prominently visible weapons. But it was the sight of her mother, wrapped in expensive furs and wearing an expression of grim satisfaction, that sent ice through Torai's veins. Victoria, Margaret called out. Thank God we found you before these savages could do you further harm. Come here immediately, child. You are safe now. The false warmth was nauseating in its hypocrisy. Margaret spoke as if she were a loving parent rescuing her child, rather than the woman who had orchestrated Torai's exile in the first place. Mother, Torai replied steadily, I am surprised to see you here. When last we spoke, you made it clear that I was no longer welcome in your home or your life. What has changed? The question forced Margaret to maintain her charade while acknowledging contradictions in her story. Captain Morrison watched with sharp attention, trying to reconcile reality with the narrative he had been given. I spoke hastily in anger, Margaret replied smoothly. A mother's love never dies, Victoria. When I learned that you had been taken captive by these people, I knew I had to bring you home safely. "Captain Morrison," Torre said, turning to address the officer directly, "I appreciate your concern, but I must tell you that I am not here against my will. I came to live among the Odawa people voluntarily, and I have been treated with kindness and respect." Her words clearly surprised the captain, who had expected to find a grateful victim eager to escape. Instead, he confronted an articulate woman showing no signs of abuse. Speaking in defense of her supposed captors, "Miss Silverton," he said carefully, "it is not uncommon for captives to develop sympathetic feelings toward their captors. May not realize the extent to which your judgment has been compromised." The condescending explanation infuriated Torre, but she remained calm. "Captain, I assure you that my judgment is perfectly clear. I understand exactly where I am and why I am here, and I am grateful for the protection and acceptance I have found among these people." But even as she spoke, Torre could see that her words had little effect on men who had already decided what they wanted to believe. The soldiers had come expecting to rescue a helpless victim, and they were not prepared to accept that their mission might be based on false premises. Behind her, she could sense Chief Ojishida and the other villagers watching, knowing that her next words would determine not just her own fate, but the safety of everyone she had come to love. The winter wind cut through her clothes as she stood between two worlds, forced to choose between the life that had rejected her and the community that had embraced her. The winter wind whipped between the soldiers and the Odawa villagers as Torre stood at the center of a confrontation that would determine not just her fate, but the safety of everyone she had grown to love. Captain Morrison's patience was clearly wearing thin as he watched what he believed was a confused captive defending her captors. "Miss Silverton," the captain said with forced authority, "I have my orders and legal documentation from your mother. You will come with us now voluntarily or otherwise. These people have no legal claim to detain a white woman against the wishes of her family." But before Tori could respond, Chief Ojishida stepped out of his lodge, moving with the quiet dignity that had first impressed her months ago. He walked to stand beside her, his presence a silent declaration that she would not face this alone. "Captain," he said, his English clear and controlled, "the woman you seek came to us through a legitimate agreement with her family. She was given to our people as payment for debts owed, witnessed by officials at Fort Benson. She has lived among us freely and contributed to our community. If she wishes to leave, she may do so. But she will not be taken by force." Margaret's face flushed with rage at this public exposure of the truth. "How dare you speak such lies?" she spat, abandoning her grieving mother performance. "My daughter was kidnapped and held against her will. These legal papers prove my authority over her as her mother and legal guardian." The mask had finally slipped, revealing the cold, controlling woman beneath the facade. Captain Morrison looked between mother and daughter with growing confusion as the contradictions in Margaret's story became impossible to ignore. "Is this true, Miss Silverton?" the captain asked directly. "Were you given to these people by your own family, or were you taken against your will?" Torai felt the weight of the moment settling on her shoulders. Her next words would either condemn the Odawa to military retaliation, or force her to return to a life of servitude under her mother's control. But as she looked at Chief Ojishida's steady gaze and remembered everything she had gained among his people, the choice became crystal clear. "Captain Morrison," she said, her voice carrying across the frozen ground with newfound strength. "My mother speaks the truth about one thing. She did give me to Chief Ojishida, but it was not kidnapping. It was punishment for my refusal to marry the man she had chosen for me. She traded me away like livestock because I was an embarrassment to her social standing." The stark honesty of Tori's declaration sent ripples of shock through both the assembled soldiers and the watching villagers. Margaret's carefully constructed narrative crumbled like a house built on sand as her own daughter exposed the cruel reality behind her supposed rescue mission. "You ungrateful child," Margaret hissed, her composure completely shattered. After everything I have done for you, all the opportunities I provided, you choose to humiliate me in front of these soldiers by defending savages over your own family." Captain Morrison held up his hand for silence, his military training, helping him cut through the emotional chaos to focus on the facts of the situation. "Mrs. Silverton," he said with growing coldness, "you led me to believe that your daughter had been kidnapped. If she was given to these people voluntarily by her own family, then this is not a military matter requiring armed intervention." The captain's words carried the weight of a man who was beginning to understand that he had been manipulated into bringing military force to bear in what was essentially a family dispute. His disgust with Margaret's deception was evident in his tone and posture. "But she is still my daughter," Margaret protested desperately, "and I have legal authority over her as an unmarried woman. The law gives me the right to determine where she lives and whom she associates with. The law also recognizes contracts and legitimate debts," Chief Ojishida interjected calmly. "Your family owed compensation to our people for broken agreements about water rights and grazing boundaries. The debt was settled according to terms you yourself proposed and accepted. That contract was witnessed by officials at Fort Benson who can verify its legitimacy." Tori watched her mother's face as the legal reality of the situation became clear. Margaret had been so confident in her ability to manipulate the narrative that she had not considered how her own actions might be used against her. The very contract she had insisted upon to rid herself of an unwanted daughter now protected Tori's right to remain where she chose. "Furthermore," Tori added, finding courage in the truth, "I am 24 years old, Captain Morrison. In most territories, that makes me legally capable of making my own decisions about where to live and whom to marry. My mother's authority over me is not absolute, especially when she has already formally relinquished that authority through legal contract." Captain Morrison looked around at the winter scene, the peaceful village, the well-cared-for woman who showed no signs of abuse or coercion, the legal complications that made his mission far more complex than he had been led to believe. His career had been built on following orders and completing missions, but this situation required judgment that went beyond simple military objectives. "Miss Silverton," he said finally, "I need you to state clearly and unambiguously whether you wish to return with your mother or remain here with these people. Your answer will determine how I proceed." The moment stretched like a held breath as Tori considered not just her immediate choice, but the life that choice would create. Returning with her mother meant wealth, comfort, and social respectability, but also a return to constant criticism, forced marriage, and a future shaped by other people's expectations. Staying meant uncertainty, hardship, and life on the margins of two worlds, but also love, acceptance, and the freedom to become who she was meant to be. She turned to look at Chief Ojishida, seeing in his dark eyes the patience to let her choose freely and the strength to support whatever decision she made. Behind him stood the villagers who had welcomed her, taught her, and valued her contributions to their community. These people had shown her what it meant to belong somewhere, not because of birth or wealth, but because of character and commitment. "I choose to remain here," she said clearly, her voice carrying across the winter air with absolute certainty. "This is my home now, these are my people, and this man is the partner I have chosen for my future. I am grateful for Captain Morrison's concern for my welfare, but I assure him that I am exactly where I want to be." Margaret's scream of rage echoed across the frozen landscape. "You fool! You throw away everything, wealth, position, respectability, for what? To live like a savage in the wilderness with people who will never truly accept you. You will regret this choice for the rest of your miserable life." But her words had lost their power to wound. Tori had learned the difference between being wanted and being valued, between conditional love and genuine acceptance. "Mother," she said with quiet dignity, "I have already lived a miserable life trying to meet your expectations. I choose instead to live a meaningful life meeting my own." Captain Morrison nodded slowly, his decision made. Mrs. Silverton, your daughter has made her choice as a legal adult. I have no authority to force her to return against her will, especially given the circumstances that brought her here. My men and I will be departing at first light, as the soldiers prepared to make camp for the night before their return journey. Margaret made one final attempt to reclaim control over her daughter's fate. Victoria, I am giving you one last chance to come to your senses. Return with me now, and I will forgive this embarrassing episode. Remain here, and I will disown you. Completely. You will inherit nothing, receive nothing, and be nothing to me. The threat that would once have terrified Torai now seemed almost pitifully empty. Mother, she replied with genuine sadness, you disowned me the day you traded me away to settle a debt. The difference is that now I have found people who claim me not as property, but as family. As dawn broke over the village the next morning, the cavalry unit prepared to depart without their intended captive. Captain Morrison approached Torai one final time before mounting his horse. Miss Silverton, I want you to know that if circumstances ever change, if you ever need assistance from the authorities, you have only to send word through Fort Richardson. His offer was made with genuine respect for her choice, even if he could not fully understand it. Torai thanked him for his consideration and watched as the military column rode away, taking with it the last connection to her old life, Margaret's. Final words were delivered from horseback as she prepared to leave the daughter she had never truly understood. You have made your choice, Victoria. Live with the consequences. I intend to, Tori replied simply, watching as her mother rode out of her life forever that evening, as the village returned to its normal rhythms after the disruption of the military visit. Chief Ojishita found Tori sitting by the river in the spot that had become special to them both. The winter air was crisp and clean, filled with the promise of spring that would come again despite the current cold. Do you regret your choice? He asked, settling beside her on the familiar fallen log. Torai considered the question seriously, thinking about everything she had given up and everything she had gained. I regret the pain it will cause some people, she said finally. I regret that my mother and I could never find understanding. But I do not regret choosing love over duty, acceptance over approval, or authenticity over respectability. Chief Ojishita took her hand in his, their fingers intertwining with the comfortable familiarity of a connection that had weathered its first major test. Then we will build our future together, step by step, season by season, until we have created something worth all the sacrifices we have made. As spring arrived and brought new life to the land around them, Tori and Chief Ojishita were married. According to Odawa traditions that honored both their individual spirits and their commitment to the community. The ceremony was simple but profound, witnessed by people who had learned to value her not for what she represented, but for who she had become. Years passed, and the story of the white woman who chose love over luxury became legend throughout the territory. Torai never bore children of her own, but she became a beloved teacher and healer whose knowledge bridged two worlds for the benefit of all. Her marriage to Chief Ojishita proved to be a partnership that strengthened both their hearts and their community. What Margaret Silverton had intended as the ultimate punishment, exile from civilized society, had become the greatest gift of Torai's life. In losing everything she thought she wanted, she had found everything she actually needed: purpose, belonging, love, and the freedom to become who she was truly meant to be. The fat ranch heiress who was given away as punishment had discovered that sometimes the cruelest betrayals lead to the most unexpected salvation, and that true worth is measured not by others' expectations, but by one's own courage to choose authentic happiness over conventional success.
Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.